I know I'm not a master. I'm not an apprentice either, so. Anyway, thank you for inviting me, Adam. What I'm going to talk about is something different from existential threats. David Chalmers, in his paper on singularity, which I think is quite a nice paper, and I recommend it to you, he's very optimistic about the technology advancing to a general intelligence, and he's also optimistic about what that entails. But he does put in some qualifications. In particular, he talks about defeaters in a sort of vague way. Defeaters, in his language, I guess, are basically existential threats. So things like asteroids slamming into the Earth, or nuclear war, or climate change inducing societal collapse, and things like that. But those are risks that are over the horizon that may well arise, but we can't foresee them imminently, certainly. I'm going to talk about risks that are not over the horizon. We can see them ahead of us, and some of them, actually, we can see them behind us. They've already occurred. Okay, so the question is, does the future look like this, or does the future look like that? So this might not be an existential threat, because there is the possibility of living like rats in the sewer or something like that, but it might not be a very nice place. Okay, so in particular, I want to talk about social threats, threats from governments and big business to the maximum utilization of the internet and technology in general. So especially the Defense Trade Controls Act. How many of you have heard of the Defense Trade Controls Act? One half people? Okay. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, probably a lot of you have heard of that, right? So I'm warming up with the TPP. That's just to help raise the general temperature of blood in the room before diving into the DTCA. So one of the problems with the Defense Trade Controls Act is the name. As an academic at University of Sydney wrote a couple of years ago, it's hardly going to get onto the 7 o'clock news. It's not exactly a soundbite that you can quote and expect to get viewers interested. Okay, these threats are very different, but they are the threats, at any rate, the threats within them, not maybe the whole things, but the threats within them are aimed at technology. Technology in Australia in particular, but not only Australia. I mean, they're basically expressions of a kind of attitude towards technology, which is foreign to me anyway, and presumably foreign to you as well. So my point here actually isn't to persuade you very much. I assume you're going to be on my side once you find out the details. I hope you'll be on my side. But to motivate people to actually do something about it, because one of the big threats with these sorts of things is that, well, they're being done in secret, as you know about the TPP probably. The negotiations are occurring in secret. The threats are a bit obscure. The language is certainly obscure. And so if people don't actually stand up and protest about these things, it's very likely to slide through without much change. Okay, so the TPP is one of these NAFTA-like US-driven free trade agreements meant to promote their own business interests ahead of everything else. That's basically what it is. So the idea is to have an open and free trading zone, but one which conforms to US rules on copyright law in particular, but lots of other things as well, including patent law and therefore pharmaceutical and healthcare rights, and for that matter, judicial rights. So it attacks, either directly or indirectly, all of these areas, and it does so in secret. And that sound familiar there, actually. I'm referring to Scott Morrison and Abbott's policy about refugees. Multinationals are allowed in the negotiations, the journalists aren't. You probably know that as well, at least so far, in the last year and a half or whatever of negotiations. So copyright provisions, the plan is to do in these trade agreement, to do pretty much what George Brandis has been talking about publicly to the press in recent weeks, which is criminalizing copyright infringement. There are provisions in the TPP to criminalize infringements that have no financial motive. Currently, there are criminal sanctions in some law, some copyright law, when there's financial gain as a motive for violating the copyright. This will extend that. Choice Magazine, which actually is on the side of the consumer here, I think gets it right when they say that what's going on in Australia anyway, as far as violating copyright with downloads, etc., is primarily the result of the cartel of multinationals like Sony and Disney cheating Australians with the region coding and things like that, and forcing prices up for Australians specifically. Here's an expression of their extreme ignorance of technology, that the draft that was released by WikiLeaks shows that temporary copies are prohibited. So this is to be read as a violation of copyright. What that really means is that any transmission of anything electronically is potentially prohibited. Maybe means it's actually being left up to the member states whether they pass laws specifically against that, but it's specifically allowing for that. So ISP caches would be potentially regulated and come under this kind of control. It criminalizes ISPs, and just as George Brandis again has been talking about, makes them enforcers so that they become responsible for, legally responsible for the content that they're providing to their customers. Parallel imports may be prohibited. That means that potentially, in order to get around restrictions on access to things in Australia, you might fail to do what you can do now, which is go on the internet and organize purchases overseas to be shipped here. Devices enabling circumvention of restrictions such as regional locks are prohibited, but they don't specify, at least in what I saw, they don't specify exactly what enablers are prohibited. You could say, since we're talking about digital communications here, that anything that allows you to edit digitally, including computers themselves, are prohibited, which is kind of perverse reading of it, but seems to be allowed by the language. And of course, as usual, it would extend, all of these agreements extend copyright as much as they can possibly get away with at the time, because we need to protect Mickey Mouse. I don't know what the earliest Mickey Mouse is, but it's at least in the 30s, by the way. Might well be in the 20s. Anyway, we need to protect Mickey Mouse into the 30th century, I'm sure, for the profits of Disney. Okay, patent provisions covering genomes of plants and animals, that's in there. So-called medical methods are covered. That means any surgery, any new surgical procedure that involves anything other than just hands alone. I guess Christians are free to find new ways of doing their surgery, but the rest of us, you'll have to pay royalties on the patents. In any technology, well, all of these provisions apply, all the patent provisions apply regardless of enhancement of known efficacy. So presumably the idea there is that when patented plants, animals, drugs, or whatever turn out to have some new use which doesn't enhance its efficacy whatsoever, they can extend the life of that patent and related patents as much as they want. They can keep on doing that. Judicial rights will be handed over to investor-state dispute settlement, which means arbitration panels bypassing the courts of Australia and other member countries, putting in jeopardy whatever we happen to have in the way of laws that restricts trade from the point of view of this agreement. So environmental laws, cigarette packaging, PBS, what have you. Okay, so that's TPP. Hopefully your blood temperature is 2 degrees higher by now, and we can move on to the DTCA, which you don't know about. So the DTCA, it's an act. It was passed 2 years ago, or the end of 2012 actually, so a year and some months ago. If you want to read my full rant about it, you can do that at Bayesians Without Borders. I have a list of URLs at the end as well, actually. So what about it? Well, the DTCA itself is maybe only a couple hundred pages long as an act. Maybe it's less than that, maybe, I don't remember. But it refers to and relies upon, especially the DSGL, which is over 300 pages, and there's an awful lot of junk there. Very few people, even those who get riled about it, go and read the whole thing. I haven't read the whole thing. I've skimmed the whole thing, and I've read lots of it, and misunderstood lots of it, and reread it, and so on. And it's quite difficult to make sense of, but I'm just going to give you the highlights today. That's all what this is about. Anyway, the basic idea, the intent behind it is that the US, Australia, and the UK some time ago signed treaties about trade in defense goods. The basic idea was to regulate military trade in the first place. So munitions, weapons, bombs, laser-guided missiles, whatever. Those sorts of things should be traded freely within the special partnership of Australia, UK, and the US, and a lot less freely outside that partnership and subject to regulation. However, they did also talk about dual-use goods, and the role of dual-use goods has slowly expanded over the years. And that's really what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about controls on military weapons trades. I think that's quite rightly put into place. But the most recent changes, and in particular the DTCA, is meant to deal with the internet. The internet allows for trade in ideas, designs, new research ideas and so forth on both military and dual-use goods. And the old regulations or laws were written in order to deal with tangible trade in the form of things that might be put on a ship and sent across an ocean. And so they've extended it to cover intangible trade. Intangible trade in military goods, but also intangible trade in dual-use goods. If you violate the rules in Australia, you are subject to 10 years imprisonment for each violation. Now this is already the law. There is a saving grace. The law has been deferred until this coming January. So you're not at risk at the moment. And another thing here, I'm speaking as an academic, and this law particularly hits academia. So those of you who are not in academia, you might feel like this is no big deal. Okay? But it also hits all high-tech industries in Australia. It's not just academia. Academia is particularly going to suffer from this, but it won't be us alone. Okay, intangible communications, of course, the internet, like I mentioned, so email, but also phone calls, publication. Publication is a communication. So if you publish information on dual-use goods that's restricted without prior permission, you get to go to prison. Conference presentations. Oral communication is another form of intangible communication. So if you're a student or a supervisor doing research in any of these areas, then that's potentially regulated. The idea is to regulate communications to foreigners outside this group of three. So if you're an Australian citizen being supervised in PhD research on one of the regulated areas, you're perfectly fine, except you're not that fine. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so what are these dual-use areas? Well, like I said, there are 350-odd pages describing the areas that are subject to new Department of Defense oversight, regulation, vetting of the research, agreement or not agreement to publish. So this includes high-performance computing, optical communications and computers, neural computers, robotics, cryptography, image and signal processing, and epidemiological research. That's not anything like an exhaustive list. The list is 300 pages long. But these are, of course, some prominent areas where Australia has some kind of research leadership in particular aspects of these things and would certainly like to have more. Okay. Also, any and all software for all of the above. Everything listed in the dual-use goods list has this software restriction attached to it. So when we're talking about robotics, what kind of software can possibly help robotics? Well, how about all of artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence will become regulated research. All of it. Sorry? I wasn't saying only artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
All artificial intelligence and lots and lots and lots and lots of other stuff. So this is a really severe threat. So in my crude estimate, something like 1/3 of technology in Australia is affected. That's just from thumbing through course catalogs to see how many subjects are actually in the list and how many are not. Okay, so here are some issues. All publications will have to be vetted. So what that means is that if you have some new research that isn't just regurgitating old research, which of course is what publications usually want, right? If you have some new research to publish, you first send it to the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense will get back to you. They say within 3 months. That's their target. I think that's a fairly laughable claim, but let us say 3 months later. So 3 months later, they get back to you and they tell you, yes, you may publish this, or no, you may not. The standard whereby they would say no is not clearly laid out in the law. This is presumably a judgment that they make in consultation with the Minister of Defense and DFAT and so on. They make some sort of judgment about whether or not it puts Australia at some kind of risk. Research projects, they would really have to be pre-approved. You could, of course, submit a grant application without getting any Department of Defense approval, but then if you receive the money, at the back end there's supposed to be outputs to these things. That's publications, right? So the idea of not getting pre-approval for ARC grant applications would be that you trust the Department of Defense. They will give you approval in the end. Not very many academics are going to be that trusting. So that means they'll have to get pre-approval for their grant applications, putting another 3 months at least on the grant application cycle. So there's a sort of a problem. Supervisions must be pre-approved. I said that if you're Australian, you're okay here, but what that really relies on is your dissertation or thesis not being published. Then it's okay. But all universities I know of publish theses and dissertations. So either that changes, or you must get pre-approval of unknown research by the Department of Defense before starting it. That comment applies to ARC grants as well. ARC grants are meant to push new research, right? What are you going to do this new? Well, you characterize it in a vague way, but is it going to be precise enough for the Defense Department to come back and say, well, we know this is perfectly safe, you'll be able to publish? That's hardly obvious. Okay, so there are just a few problems here for the academic world. The Department of Defense, I mean, here's the good news. The good news is the Department of Defense is going to have to expand hugely, so all of our students have guaranteed employment for life. There's no bloody way they're going to make these kinds of judgments on thousands and thousands of pieces of new research projects without thousands and thousands of new employees. It's completely impossible. They have to judge what's new versus old research. They have to judge what's basic versus applied, because that's a specific issue in the DSGL. And they have to judge what exploratory research, which is unspecified, may or may not be allowed. They're going to have to anticipate the unknown unknowns, rather better than Donald Rumsfeld. Oversight is by the Minister of Defense and the government of the day. I'm sure that really reassures all of you, as it does me. Now, there are corresponding parallel laws in the UK and the US. It's not us on our own. There's the Export Controls Act in the UK and ITAR in the US. However, both of them have explicit protections against the kind of bureaucratic encroachment that I'm talking about here. Scientific research in the UK, this is from the Export Controls Act. Scientific research is itself specifically excluded. Publication is protected, university research and education is protected, so that includes supervisions. So none of this criticism applies to those laws. There was a proposal in October 2012 when this bill was passed to the Senate committee, within the Senate committee, to alter the bill to make it accord with UK law, and that was rejected. Okay, so if nothing changes, this is what will happen. And it will pretty much start happening in very high volume and frequency in about 10 months. It's already beginning. Research projects have closed. Researchers are talking about leaving. Students are going to start talking about going elsewhere because they can't do the projects they want to do. And basically, Australian university will go to shit. The university system in high tech will go to shit, and it's not going to be any secret. Now, I don't think it's going to be that bad, actually. I'm a mini optimist about this. I'm not a macro optimist about this. The real optimist here is Ian Chubb, Australia's chief scientist. He's very confident that he's going to be able to take care of the whole mess. Now, what has happened is in the legislation, instead of passing amendments to make it correspond to UK and US legislation, there was one amendment that got through at the last minute, which was setting up this Strengthened Export Controls Steering Group. Strengthened export controls, of course, means tightening the screws on the export of both military and dual-use goods. Anyway, Chubb heads it. It's about half defense industry and Defense Department bureaucrats and about half other people. So it's not dominated by DoD interests. It's only half DoD interests. And they're doing a number of things, including running a pilot program at UQ to see how it affects certain particular disciplines as examples of the kind of additional bureaucratic pain and red tape that you have to deal with to do your research. That will be ending. It'll be ending at the end of this year, along with the suspension, 2-year suspension period that was passed along with that. So the idea of the 2-year suspension is that you can go ahead and publish in these areas, and the government and DoD agree not to go and prosecute you for it retroactively. There are certain people I know who don't trust that provision, and they've stopped their research. Okay, at the end of the period, they're to make recommendations to Parliament, and that's the key. For Ian Chubb, that's the key. He thinks he'll make his recommendations, they'll be accepted, and everything will be happy. For me, it's the key because I think he'll make his recommendations, and a few of them will be accepted in order to keep people quiet, and we will not be very happy. Currently, there's a current round of consultation. There's always consultation going on. In fact, next week I'm going to a DECO DFAT presentation in the city on this subject, and I'll hear what they have to say about this. But anyway, the rumor is that there are specific recommendations about to come out of Chubb's group, in particular to remove the publication offense, to have permits for publication and research and so forth, not at the individual project or publication level, but at the organizational level. So Monash, or maybe the Faculty of Engineering or something like that, would get a general permit, and then within that they'd be expected to monitor what happens and advise the Department of Defense if some of their academics need to be prosecuted. In any event, they're certain to fall well short of the UK-US provisions, so I object to them in principle. Okay, so the future without such regulation may well be utopia, as some people here clearly believe. But the future with such regulation is certainly no utopia, at least not for academics or high-tech industry. If changes are not made, if people don't get up and shout that changes must be made, then I think what will happen is the high-tech research industry in Australia, both academic and industrial, will quickly disintegrate. Like I said, my full rant is on my blog, Bayesians Without Borders. WikiLeaks has TPP leaks, at least 3 of them. There's a campaign against the TPP at Fight for the Future. Choice has a review, as I mentioned. Electronic Frontiers has a TPP and other kinds of campaign pages. Victims of DSTO you might not have heard about. That's run by some people associated with private industry who claim they've been ripped off on IP by DSTO, that they've stolen their intellectual property with impunity. And this is another one I ran through the same people who run victims of DSTO. Ozloop is kind of interesting. It's bureaucrats in the Australian government complaining about their bosses. So it's kind of entertaining. Yes?
Can I just say thank you very much for bringing the TPP in and discussing the TPP in a public forum. I've been involved in a campaign against it for a couple of years now, for a couple of years and counting. I think that it's important to remember that information is power, and it would seem that this act here would concentrate power, the power of information from research and so forth, in the hands of the military-industrial complex, for want of a better term.
Absolutely. It's intended to do.
Certainly. So, yes, I definitely thought that as a possibility. But it might be interesting for people to know and consider in this room as well that that before the Victorian Parliament at the moment is a law which effectively prohibits public protest, and that people are looking at 2-year jail terms for, blocking the entrance to like a business or basically any kind of picketing or protesting activity that the police on duty at the time deem not in the public interest. So it's part of a wider trend to criminalise dissent across the world. Like we've got laws coming in Spain and certainly in Australia and many other places. Yes, the Ukraine, that's a notable example. Yeah. Yes, well, that's a work in progress, that one. But I suppose what my question is, how would you recommend people proceed as futurists to have I see a lot of this technology, the development of technology is not devoid of political implications. If people really would like to see their technology put in service of a more equitable world, what would you recommend they do in order to prevent these dystopic scenarios from manifesting?
Well, I may not be the best person to ask for recommendations about political action. I have been politically active in the past, but that was the long past. It was the Vietnam War. And we were successful then, actually, in the United States. I would just put it to you as futurists that clearly you have some stake, at least if you're on the utopian side of enthusiasm for future technology, you have some stake in protecting the technology and its advancement, and you keep that in mind. In particular, you keep in mind that these threats, they're existential threats which maybe are more devastating should they be realized, but they're of dubious probability, at least in the near term. I think in the long term it's certain. But here, these things are very high probability, and they're still pretty bad, pretty nasty. So I think you take it to your politicians, you take it to your political parties if you're in a political party, you take it to your bosses, you take it to everybody you can, and you complain about this crap. Yep.
The question is, who's behind it? I mean, who are the individuals or groups that are pushing this?
Yeah, well, I don't have a clear answer to that. The United States as a whole is clearly behind an awful lot of this. Why are they behind it? It's certainly not the case that the population of the US is 100% behind this. This is particularly reflecting the interests of IP owners, of big IP owners, not little ones like me, but Sony and Disney and MGM and organizations like that. They're clearly very strongly behind moves to control the internet, to weaken its ability to source new projects, new ideas, new IP, and to maximize what they can squeeze out of their old IP. Yeah.
Are there any sort of historical precedents to sort of look back to, considering that we had a period of Cold War where presumably, you know, we would have dealt with these sorts of restrictions before, considering that, you know, microprocessors, nuclear, you know, capabilities, all of these things would have been restricted in some sort of way previously. Is there any experience? Yeah. So is there any? Is this really such a shock to society? What it'll be like living under these restrictions?
The extension to dual-use goods is new. That's been developing over the past few decades, but it certainly doesn't go back to the Cold War. It doesn't go back to World War II. This is all an encroachment of control, state control, that's taken place in recent decades. So in that sense, there's no precedent. Of course, there's precedent in that military goods have been controlled ever since governments had them.
Well, to answer that question, I'd suggest it's going back to the times of the medieval times of the Roman Catholic Church, deeming what is appropriate to publish in terms of research. You know, looking at, say, the heliocentric.
Oh, well, if you're talking about controls over freedom of speech, that surely goes back to the pharaohs and beyond. Well, if you spoke out against the priests in Pharaoh, Egypt, you wouldn't have lived very long.
My question, it's kind of answering some of the questions proposed by Andrew Dunn's talk, where he's talking about do we have technological determinism or not? Well, judging from your talk, it seems that technological development is being channeled, you know, in very narrow directions rather than, you know, a natural evolution.
Well, I don't know what natural and unnatural is. Technology has always been channeled and manipulated by the state, and it always will be. But there's some manipulations which can really cause a lot of damage and should be protested against.
I agree, but there seems to be this kind of idea that technology is just somehow, you know, a force in itself.
Well, in many ways it is, of course, because it has so many diverse and powerful effects that are not or poorly anticipated, that the government perhaps tries to control and fails to, and so on. So I certainly agree that it's a force unto itself. I don't agree that it unfolds deterministically, but then I'm an indeterminist, so I would say that. Yeah.
Just a couple of queries if I can. Just a comment, possibilities of passive resistance, possibility of overloading with spurious research queries, and possibility of bypassing ISPs with virtual private networks.
Yes, certainly there are possibilities of bypassing ISPs and augmenting the technology. As far as that's concerned, I'm rather sympathetic with Brazil. The whole idea of the internet being controlled by the United States, I think, is perverse and sick, and we should have grown out of that a long time ago. And given the NSA and their activities there, there's every reason to do that sort of thing now. Absolutely. I'm in favor of it. I support. Yeah.
Hasn't there already been a history of the costs of ITAR or whatever compliance being sufficiently high in a small country like this that it will overseas already?
Yes. Companies have been driven overseas already, and this just adds to the burden for many of them. That's right. As far as inundating the Department of Defense, I mean, that might make for an interesting demonstration and so on, but it would just make life that much worse for anyone who depends on them. So I don't know about that one. Yeah.
Well, in terms of what you've said, infantry drills, are you planning autopilots and things like that? That is free software. Every time he makes a commit, he's committing the offence unless they
Starting in January. For now, he's safe, relatively. Yes?
This legislation covers private researchers as well, not just institutional researchers.
It covers Australia.
Yeah, so how is the law being disseminated to the general public? Is it just like most legislation is just, I suppose, it's published and one assumes that one
It
knows
is
about
published.
Yeah.
You can go and see it.
Yeah. But obviously it's got no
Well,
coverage.
it's like my secretaries at Monash University. When I complain about them not having informed me of some regulation, they say, it's on the internet. Surely you've read it already.
So has there been any decent press coverage of the DTSA?
There has been some. If you do a search on Google and news for this stuff, you'll find a couple of Sydney Morning Herald articles. You'll probably end up finding the Senate Committee submissions page. Universities Australia, NTEU, various people put in submissions. You'll also find my blog page, and so on. But it hasn't been promoted very widely. That's beginning to change now. It's picking up now because a year and a half ago, a 2-year suspension period sounds like a nice, comfortable, it's over the horizon, who cares? Somebody will take care of it. And that's frankly the response of most academics to being informed of this as a problem is, that's too goddamn stupid to be a real threat. It's never going to happen. Okay, but now, it's 9 months away, and people are beginning to say, well, gee, I guess we better start planning for it. My own bosses have been running around in little circles asking for inputs to plan for the impact of this. And anyway, whatever. It's depressing.
Even Fred Ned in his garage isn't allowed to do any research or invent.
No, he's allowed to do whatever research he wants. He just can't publish it.
Yeah, I had a question about that. Where does it live, this censored material, and who can then access it? Because presumably the whole military-industrial complex doesn't want to stop development, they want to squander it. Surely they want to still encourage development. So where does it live?
Military-industrial complex, I mean, it's a convenient phrase from Eisenhower. Realistically, the military-industrial complex is located in the United States. There is no such thing in Australia. There are a few individual defense companies and there are subcontractors, but there's no such industry in Australia. There's no interest here. And from the other side of the water, I'm sure that people running Lockheed Martin and so on look at this stuff and they say, God, those guys are imbeciles. This is great for us. We're going to completely destroy the little industry there is in Australia and absorb it all ourselves. That's wonderful. Please shoot yourself in the head again.
Well, technically we'll have more access to information than we did previously. That's the whole
Well,
point.
what we will have is the ability to buy military and dual-use goods from America.
Which is pretty good.
Yeah, of course. It just means we won't be making any ourselves or doing any of the research or having any of the input into any of that.
But they subject themselves to similar controls. That's
No, they
Well, no,
do
they
not.
haven't.
That was one of my points. ITAR does not have this kind of restriction. The UK doesn't have this kind of restriction. They allow research and publication. They allow supervision. That's us. If you don't believe it, go read the stuff on those websites. Go read the submissions to the Senate Committee. It may not turn out that way because Ian Chubb is making recommendations which are sensible and aimed in the right direction. Okay, but The look is that it's going to end up somewhere between total insanity, which is the plain law unamended, and UK-US, somewhere in the middle, not with the UK and the US. We will be unequal partners. It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yep.
I just wonder if I pointed out something else that I find a little bit insidious about TPP. I just wanted to point out that, I mean, we live in a democracy, right? And that, well, yeah, so good, you've called my bluff. Basically, freedom of assembly and also the ability for communities to vote down initiatives or legislation or hold governments to account. Under TPP, if the government passes a law that could impact on the future profits of a corporation, they can basically sue the government.
Yes.
So,
outside the jurisdiction of the government.
Yes, so even if you had successful dissent, passive dissent as someone called it, all of those sort of things, and community was in united opposition to a particular piece of legislation, the government would not be able to, your elected officials would not be able to enforce it under the TPP.
This is the tire rights, that's right.
Yeah, so...
Although the suit might go against them. You never know.
It could, but I think that what I'm trying to drive at is that sovereignty is effectively completely eroded by the TPP. And also, worryingly, Abbott was one of its chief cheerleaders at Davos recently and trying to encourage everyone to sign up to it. So the idea that we could perhaps decide as a nation to leave the agreement is very unlikely. So we are in a situation where not only is protesting something like the TPP about to become illegal, that even if we, yeah. So this is the thing. Like I know, and it's frustrating, but like I think that as futurists, we need to be more engaged in creating the world that is enabling the kind of egalitarian initiatives and technologies that we all hope seem to champion or want to champion. So I would recommend that everyone in this room take personal responsibility to manifest a preferred future.
You're here. I'll second the recommendation. Shall we vote? More?
Okay.
Will the presentation be uplinked on SciFuture?
Well, it will certainly be somewhere on the internet. If it's not taken down before you get to view it, at some stage it will be on the internet. It will be on my YouTube channel.
Never know. NSA might erase it while you upload it.
Huh? Yeah, that's right. They must be pretty intelligent sniffers to be able to...
Sorry?
I was thinking more your slides.
My slides. Yeah, well, I think I just refer you to my blog, because I have under this title an article that goes into the details. That article, furthermore, links to all the relevant things like the Senate committee submissions page. I noticed that it was broken because they changed parliaments and they changed the internal linkage. But anyway, I fixed that today. So you can get to those things, you can get to submissions, you can get to the law, and so on. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Any other questions? Going? Okay, well, no.
The temporary copies prohibition in the TPP. You're referring to memory, I presume that was computer memory.
Yes.
But influenced by the previous speaker.
Well, technically speaking,
we've got a copy of this.
yeah, well, nobody's actually talked about doing MRI on people's brains to see what sort of representations are left of Mickey Mouse in your brain. I think that really would be extreme. But people have actually talked about cache memory and stuff like that in ISPs. And as far as I know, that's covered.
I just think it's all relevant to pointing out how ridiculous this law is.
Yeah, well, it underlines just how ignorant of technology the negotiators are. The negotiators are people representing big copyright owners and states. They aren't representing technology.
And they're mostly lawyers.
Yep, they're mostly lawyers and they're mostly idiots.
Thank you.